Let's start by talking about the legislation formerly known as the One Big Beautiful Bill
Yeah.
Act. I have followed a lot of the coverage that's on Substack from folks who formerly considered themselves Republicans or conservatives. And on one hand, the commentary is like, oh, Trump campaigned as a populist, but now is governing as a standard fare Republican or conservative, tax cuts for businesses and the wealthy and cuts to benefits for, folks on Medicaid or SNAP benefits or the like, work requirements, that's standard conservative fare.
Right.
And so I'm curious for people who used to be conservatives, does this legislation look good?
Well, from my point of view, no. I mean, it's a complete disaster. It represents to me the end of fiscal conservatism as we know it. In fact, I wrote yesterday that this felt like an extinction level event for fiscal conservatives. They couldn't even mount what they could not even scrape together more than a couple of votes in the House of Representatives for a bill that will absolutely explode the national debt. We're talking about adding $4 or $5 trillion with a lot of budgetary gimmicks. So, you're right when you say that there's certain things that kind of, just sound like Republican orthodoxy from the past. But when you're talking about the kinds of debt and deficit, I mean, we talked about Wisconsin politics. I probably did 150 interviews with people like Paul Ryan, talking about the looming debt crisis and how we needed to confront this. This was the greatest intergenerational transfer of wealth. And yet now you look back on it and go, okay, what was that all about, given what's in this bill? And also, there's just so much packed into this bill. The lack of transparency, the end of any sort of reasonable legislative process, and then just the sort of the random giveaways that sound a little bit more like a South American banana republic than anything that we've seen before. So, but we can get into this a little bit more because I think that there is a debt. I'm going to be a little contrarian here. I think that there's a tendency among Democrats to think that this is, by definition, going to be a disaster for Republicans. I agree with that, but I think they should not underestimate what Trump is going to do with this bill.
Okay, well then let's talk about that. This
Yeah.
bill starts off as the most unpopular major legislation passed since at least 1990. It's about 23 points or so underwater to start off with. If you look back at the repeal of Obamacare that Republicans tried in 2017, that was less popular, but of course it didn't actually pass. The original 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was about 20 percentage points underwater, so not so far off from where this is. And Democrats feel like they have this message of Republicans are looking out for the wealthy, we're looking out for everybody else. But you say they should slow their roll.
No,
Why do you think that's the case?
no, I'm just simply going to offer a cautionary note because I agree. I mean, obviously, the polls indicate this is historically unpopular. Historically, big bills like this generally do not help the party in power. I actually think this will be an albatross around the necks of swing district Republicans. But I do want to caution a couple of things. Number one, most people have not paid attention. They do not know what's in the bill. So the race is on to define it. I think it would be a mistake to underestimate Trump's ability to sell and to mislead. I mean, this may come as a shock to some of your listeners here, but Donald Trump will lie about what's in this bill. He's already started lying about what's in this bill, sending out the letter to Social Security recipients about no tax on Social Security. And he's going to talk about all of the goodies, the bright shining objects. And my concern, and again, I'm not making a prediction here. I'm just saying that having gone through this in the past, the framing of the bill as a giveaway to the wealthy at the expense of the poor is absolutely true. But if Democrats approach this with a whiteboard approach, saying, you should care about the $4 trillion deficit or debt that it's going to add. If they talk in abstractions, what Trump is going to they may miss what Trump is going to do. Trump is going to sell this on a retail basis. not what I'm doing for the country, but what I'm doing for you, that I am giving you a giveaway. I am saying no taxes on tits. If you work overtime, there'll be no taxes on overtime. If you buy, a big ass truck, you will not have to pay taxes on the interest. And it will be that very sort of specific selling these specific things. And the way the bill is structured, in going into the midterms, what the Republicans and Trump will say will be that the Democrats will now raise your taxes on all of those things because there's a cliff, right? So he's going to say, look, if you vote for Democrats, they're going to tax your tits, they're going to tax your overtime, they're going to go back and raise your taxes on Social Security. I don't think that that's going to change the dynamic of the election, but I think it would be naive for Democrats to underestimate the push. And also, I think they need to understand, and this is something Republicans understand very clearly now. Trump understands is that there is no election cycle. It is permanent politics all the time. And so the campaign to define this has to start right now. Cannot wait until the midterm elections to be able to do this. And so I'm just presenting the I'm presenting this because one of, I think, the great dangers for the resistance is are falling into bubbles, alternative reality silos, where you don't see things that are coming. And having underestimated Donald Trump now for years, this would be a bad time to do it again. And again, I'm just providing a caution, not a prediction.
Yeah, and I think in looking at the ad impact data, we can already see that both Republicans are and Democrats are campaigning on this legislation and along pretty predictable lines, right?
Right.
Republicans are saying that Democrats voted against a tax break for Americans and voted against securing the border. And then Democrats are saying that Republicans are, cutting Medicaid and taking from the poor to give to the rich, et cetera.
Yes.
Now, the focus on healthcare on Democrats' part and the focus on a tax cut on Republicans' part is not all that different from 2018, right? Democrats were saying, hey, Republicans just tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And Republicans were saying, hey, we just passed the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which gave the median American more money. And, also part of their argument was, reshoring capital and industry. That obviously, didn't work
Did
for
not work.
Republicans to hold on to the House, for example. So, understanding your sort of concerns here, why do you think this go round 2026 would be any different? Democrats run on healthcare, Republicans run on tax cuts, and in the end, the backlash to maybe the legislation, but also just Trump in general, who's already, underwater in terms of net favorability,
Right.
play play their course, and we see what we almost always see: the party in control losing seats at the midterm.
Well, I think that is going to happen. I want to make that clear. However, since I want to at least throw out the contrarian cautions here, a couple of the things are different. I mean, number one, first of all, in some ways, the Republicans have a weaker hand because this is just an extension of tax cuts. It doesn't actually cut taxes. People are not going to look at their tax and go, "Whoa, look what I just got." Now, back in 2017, there was actually a tax cut, right? This
Well,
is
except for
just
the
like
salt folks, the people in New
right.
York and California, New Jersey, they're pretty happy.
And Wisconsin and Wisconsin.
And
I mean,
Wisconsin,
so
there you go.
there are some things, but here's the thing that I think that we need to understand is that, man, I really don't want to be misunderstood on this. Okay, is that in case people haven't noticed, the Trump White House has gotten much more effective, and I don't mean this in a positive way whatsoever. Trump 2.0 is fundamentally different than Trump 1.0. They didn't really know what they were doing the first time around. Now the Velociraptors have figured out how to open the doors, and we're seeing a much more ruthless and focused, and frankly, in some ways, competent messaging from this White House, not from Donald Trump himself, who continues to be whatever he continues to be Donald Trump, but they are much more united and I think focused. So there is that. So, I think that you also mentioned, though, that Trump is underwater. There are so many other issues that are going on right now. There are so many other things that are happening that I think are going to be a dead weight on Republicans. And I think that they're in denial about, for example, how is immigration actually playing out. They were absolutely convinced that this was going to be a positive for them. And that now I think they are underwater. The pictures of the troops in Los Angeles, I believe that Stephen Miller and Donald Trump thought that that would be, a complete winner. Law and order. Look how strong we are. In fact, I think that people are cringing about all of that. So there's a lot going on beyond this bill. One of the things that I think that I picked up over the years is that the media in Washington tends to focus on these big pieces of legislation, and they think that they're much more consequential than they actually turn out to be in the election. Um, One of the big, exceptions I think was, for example, in 2010, the reaction to Obamacare. But I do think this is going to be a negative for Republicans. And I think in part it's going to be because when people begin to see the human cost of it, and this is the thing when I talk about a whiteboard, don't deal in abstractions, deal in specifics, deal in specific stories. I think you're seeing that with immigration, you're seeing that with the Medicare cuts, Medicaid cuts. And one of the things that is very different this year is they have slashed Medicaid, which is a program that many Trump voters rely upon. So this is kind of the cutting against the populist message of Donald Trump. Now, Democrats are going to have to figure out a way to make that feel tangible, the human cost of it. The most of the draconian cuts are scheduled to take place after the midterm. Tom Tillis made this point, but I think they can do it. But again, um, if they fall into a bubble where they think this is a done deal, I think that would be a mistake.
Yeah, I think that the Medicaid piece is a little complicated, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this, which increasingly folks are saying Republicans are shooting themselves in their own foot by making cuts to Medicaid because now they have lower income voters as part of their coalition who might rely on Medicaid. I mean, if you look at the distribution of Medicaid across House districts, for example, you still see that clearly the majority of people in the most Medicaid reliant districts are Democrats, right? This is still
Right.
the poorest Americans still vote for Democrats, even though this sort of, working class, lower middle class voter has become increasingly Trumpian. We're talking about people there who make like $50,000, $60,000 a year. Whereas when we're talking about these Medicaid cuts, we're talking about people who may make less than $20,000 a year. And not only do those people still vote more for Democrats, they also vote at some of the lowest rates in the country in general. And so the whether or not this affects you personally, piece of this maybe secondary to the broader message. Like I don't think, and of course the top income tier in America, looking at exit polls, decidedly went for Kamala Harris. So I don't think that people are going to be voting on the personal effects of this legislation. Like I lost my Medicaid, so I am voting for Democrats. Now, of course, that could happen. That will happen for some people.
Yeah.
But in terms of the broad electorate that turns out in 2026, I think most of those people will not be voting based on whether this was a net positive or net negative for their finances, but more based on a vibe of what kind of person does this party care about? What kind of person does that party
Right.
care about?
Well, that's what I meant by the stories. And it's, so it may not be you, but let me just talk about immigration for a moment. I mean, people may in the abstract say we need to secure the border, we need to actually, deport, criminals who are, migrants who are criminal. But what's happening now is the stories of the grandma who is, being deported, or a student who's being grabbed off the street by mass people. They are seeing those stories. They may not be personally affected. I think you're going to see the same thing happening with healthcare, is that people may not be directly affected. Many people will be. But when they see the impact on rural clinics, on rural hospitals, I mean, this will be a story in every single state of what's going to happen. I think that will underline the point that you're making about, well, what are your values. One of the strongest things that Donald Trump had going for him was to say that I am on your side. I am for you. They are for someone else. And this story, as people begin to see the kind of cuts that may be happening to somebody else, I think it will underline the fact that, hold it, who are you really for? Are you really the the voice of the forgotten American, or are you basically screwing them over?
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about the debt and deficit, and maybe that will lead us to talk a little bit about Elon Musk and then maybe Wisconsin politics eventually. So, of course, Republicans have made the decision to prioritize probably tax cuts over
Yeah.
reducing the debt and deficit. This is going to increase over the next decade the debt by about $4 trillion, according to some nonpartisan accounting. And so I think you have concluded as a conservative yourself that the Republican Party doesn't care about the debt and deficit. Democratic Party doesn't seem to care that much about the debt and deficit either. I promise I can speak. So that in some ways, a couple things could happen. That leaves an opening for somebody else to make the case. That could mean that Americans just don't care, period, and won't care even as we move into the next
Yeah.
5 to 10 years. Or one of the parties could decide to make the case. How do you think the politics of the debt and deficit play out in the coming, I don't know, maybe sooner than 10 years, maybe 3 to 5 years?
Well, it is in that period when people begin to realize, and this hasn't happened yet, that this actually does matter in the real world. It matters in terms of spending priorities, and it matters in terms of what's going to happen to interest rates. But let's just talk about Elon Musk for a moment here. Um, I thought it was really extra. I mean, first of all, one of the great dramas of this year has been the breakdown of the bromance between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, and the all the performative chainsaw attempts to cut spending that failed absolutely miserably. I mean, Elon Musk is the world's richest man, and up until recently, felt like he was the co-president of the United States. He tried to flex his political muscles on this bill by raising the questions about the debt and the deficit. And what happened? I think what happened was that he realized that he has no clout left in the Republican Party whatsoever. I mean, he was not able to move anybody. The House Freedom Caucus just brushed him off. I mean, this was a rapid, unscheduled disassembly of his political clout. So the thing about Elon Musk is Elon Musk's political instincts are not great. It's very difficult to start a third party, especially a third party that is that esoteric. Having said that, if he does go ahead, it would seem likely that he would draw votes from Republicans, and it doesn't take that many in a closely divided country to create problems. So Elon Musk can be a real irritant to the Republican Party, but I don't see a political party growing up, like sort of a quasi-libertarian. Let's talk about the debt and the deficit. I mean, one of the things we've learned is that both Republicans and Democrats will talk about it when the other party's in power, and then they just don't give a shit about it when they're in power themselves.
Well, the exception to that is the experience of Ross Perot in the early 90s, and then subsequently Bill Clinton taking the debt and deficit seriously because they felt like that argument
Right.
had political clout and would ultimately help Clinton politically if he was able to balance the budget and pay off some of the debt. And that happened. So, I mean, maybe it's not Elon Musk, but maybe it's, I don't know. Obviously, the Democratic party is searching for some sort of path out of the wilderness and seems to be at a moment where it's willing to try perhaps some things that it hasn't tried before. And that might not be in the more conservative direction. It may be in the more, liberal, socialist, progressive direction as well. But
They have
in
tried
some
that before.
ways, in some ways, things don't have political sway unless you try. Like, you have to make the argument, and the debate has to play out in public before you know whether or not it has real purchase. And because nobody's talking about the debt and deficit seriously right now and trying to really hold the other party's feet to the fire on it, we don't actually know if it has purchase in American politics in 2025.
Well, that's right. But Elon Musk is not the guy. I saw somebody said, the good news is that somebody's talking about a third party that's going to talk about substance. The bad news is Elon Musk. So, I've been for the last 10 years, there's always been this sort of fantasy like, is there some third way? Is there somebody that's going to come forward? Is there a Mark Cuban out there who could rattle things rattle the duopoly, and maybe that's possible. I do think that we are, in an era, as you know, of outsized personality politicians as opposed to issues. And then if you had somebody who was charismatic, who could cut through all of this and tap into something, something might happen. But the deck is stacked so intensely against a third party right now. It doesn't mean that you can't have somebody popping up. Now, let me just mention just parenthetically because I need to annoy at least some of your listeners. The Democrats do are kind of still flailing around like, what is our message here? There are two paths. They have a really good bench right now of centrist Democrats who are winning in places where Trump wins. People like Alyssa Slotkin, people like Abigail Spanberger, people like, Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey. Um, on the other hand, they seem to also have a penchant for the bright, shiny objects. And they tried the defund police socialist thing before. It is not the kind of thing that is going to get them back to the majority. I mean, as much as people love AOC or love the Democratic Socialist of America candidate in New York, trust me, they would not be able to win in any swing district in America. They will not be the majority makers. And in many ways, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that in 2026, the the if they follow their normal playbook, what Trump and MAGA will do is they will try to nationalize the most extreme Democrats. That while you have all these pragmatic centrist Democrats, they are going to try to make the Democratic, the socialist mayor of New York, the face of the Democratic Party. And I think that people need to be aware of all of this. That there was that moment back in 2019. Remember when all the Democrats stood on stage and they said, "Yes, let's decriminalize the border. Yes, we want, a variety of things." And Kamala Harris told the ACLU that she would support taxpayer support for, sex transition for prisoners. Donald Trump spent $100 million on that one ad, on that one issue, you know, and it took Democrats by surprise because they didn't, I don't think they saw it coming. But I do think that at some point, Democrats have to decide, do they want to scratch their ideological id or do they want to win elections? Do they want to play around with defunding the police again? Or do they want to actually take control of the Senate and the House of Representatives? And I think that's still, frankly, up in the air.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece something along these lines in the New York Times recently about how, if you want to win in competitive elections, you can't be all of one thing. You can't be just a Republican and the unpopular caricature of a Republican, or just a Democrat and the unpopular caricature of a Democrat. And that in many ways, taking idiosyncratic positions on different policies, or even just talking about things that have not yet been politicized and placing yourself above the fray, is a way to do that. And Trump did that in 2016 to significant effect. In the time since, he's obviously still a celebrity and still this sort of like television businessman and the like, and is very different from pretty much anyone else in politics. I think there are folks who will hear what you said about, you know, Democrats should stay focused on electability, and the folks like Abigail Spanberger or the like. And they'll say, well, I don't know, like Republicans just had a bit of a YOLO experience with Trump, and, things haven't worked out perfectly for them. The midterms have been really rough, special elections have been really rough during the Trump era, but, they've got a majority today, however slim, in, uh, you know, both branches of Congress, and they also have the White House and a majority ideologically on the Supreme Court. So why not pull a YOLO and go with some more, wild characters within the Democratic Party?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with half of that. Yes, let's have some entertaining characters. I mean, the Democratic Party really ought to engage in some introspection. In 2016, what did they do? They put up Hillary Clinton. 2024, they almost put up Joe Biden, and the notion that you would put up Andrew Cuomo for mayor of New York. No, you need to move past the gerontocracy. You need to move past the boring, generic beige candidate. I get that. However, that does not mean pouring kerosene over yourself, lighting yourself on fire, and saying, "Yes, let's all embrace the agenda of the Democratic Socialists of America. This is
Wait,
still
isn't that
America."
how?
Understand that, no, 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 because we talk about
Oh,
YOLO.
I'm not here to
Yeah.
defend I'm not here to
No, no, no.
defend any part of any party, to be frank, but,
Mm,
you know, I feel like the never Trumpers of 2016 and beyond
mm.
would have said, "This is the Republican version of pouring kerosene all over ourselves."
Yes,
We're
I
going
believe that.
full bore with, someone who has, like, radical views on different things about democratic norms and whatnot. So they may again so Democrats may say, okay, well, the same people are telling Democrats not to pour kerosene on themselves. It seems to have worked in one way or another for Republicans. We might as well try pouring kerosene on ourselves.
Yeah, that strikes me as a classic example of bad logic. But I mean, yes, let's have young, fresh people who are able to talk to people in a completely different way. But we've been through the whole, and I'm sorry to keep coming back to the defund of the police, but because I think every once in a while, there are political parties that learn their lessons, and then there are those who like keep going back and like, what if we tried? The New York mayor's election can be incredibly misread. Okay, so Mamdani won because he ran a really good campaign. He was a charismatic figure, and he was running against Andrew fucking Cuomo. So people should take from that the example that, hey, fresh candidates who go out and interact with the people and are entertaining and smart. They're going to vote for that person over the boring sex pest recycling types like Andrew Cuomo. If, however, they read that and go, okay, so yes, I think a candidate who has pledged to seize the means of production, who is part of a party that calls for America to defund the police, release prisoners from prisons, and pull out of NATO. No, 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 no. That is not what I think the lesson you take from it. So there are two versions of that. Yes, you need something new and fresh and maybe a little bit risky, but you know, um, recycled left wing, you know, socialist politics is not fresh and new. It's been tried before. And I have to tell you that every Republican that I know cannot wait to talk about this. It is, and they do not think that is a threat. Trust me, they think it's a gift.
I have maybe something of a personal question here, which is we've talked a little bit about the debt and deficit and how Americans don't, or the parties don't seem particularly focused on it. And at least at this moment in time, the American electorate isn't also particularly motivated by it. Looking at recent elections might give you some sense of this, but also if you look at academic research, things seem to suggest that American voters are not particularly motivated by democratic norms either, right? There's some research that's been shown that if your preferred candidate ideologically violates democratic norms, it's only about 3% of Americans on like either side, Democrats or Republicans, who would switch parties, who would switch their ideological, would subdue their ideological preferences and choose the candidate who's more supportive of democratic norms. That's not a lot of people. And I feel like part of the Never Trump movement is motivated by, okay, well, Republicans gave up on conservatism. So things like the debt and deficit and other things that they said they cared about. And they also have violated democratic norms along the way. I mean, how does it feel to be and so looking at past elections and looking at some of this research, it doesn't seem like Americans care that much about the debt and deficit. And it also seems to suggest that Americans do not prioritize democratic norms in the same way that folks like yourself might. What do you make of all of that? How do you sort of make sense of it? How does it feel?
Um, well, it's soul crushing. What can I say? I mean, it has been a disillusioning experience, and you are absolutely right about all of that. And I think this has been a wake up. um, for people. And I wrote yesterday. I mean, let's be honest about it. I mean, never Trump as part of the creating a rational remnant in the Republican Party has failed. I mean, it is expired because it doesn't exist anymore. So I also think that there are one of the problems of being in a bubble. And by the way, I'm just agreeing with the premise of your question, though, is that being in a bubble, it becomes easy to in recycling the same things. Like I care deeply about democratic norms. I care deeply about what I would call, liberal democracy and the constitutional norms. Clearly, those don't resonate with a lot of voters. So I'm trying to think how blunt should I be here? So I'm a
Go
contributor
for
to
it.
MS. Okay, so I'm a contributor to MSNBC, and which is part of the progressive bubble where they recycle things. And at some point, and I think I did say this on the air once, is like, folks, we have to stop using the same stale terminology that we've used that has not worked in the past. It's the same talking point again and again. So things like liberal democratic norms, very much a maybe an esoteric thing. So I think now instead of talking about, and again, I'm not saying let's abandon those things, but I think that right now, if you look at what's happening in the era of Trump 2.0, I think that we need to recapture certain things like freedom. Okay, so democracy means a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think of, take back freedom from the Trumpist right. Because I think when you see the troops on the street, the masked agents and everything, the right wing cancel culture, I think you go right at their strength. I think you start talking about freedom because I do think that there is a residual belief in that. And let me tell you my surprise of the year so far. Um, I actually thought that the polls would show that Americans didn't have a problem with sending troops to Los Angeles, that they didn't have a problem with the renditioning of Abrego Garcia to El Salvador, or Trump ignoring the courts. I thought that he was going to get away with that. And in fact, the polls came back showing that in fact he was deeply underwater, which tells me that there is at least a residual belief in things like due process, freedom, the rule of law. Now, maybe those are not the terms that people would use, but we're in a moment, I think, of relearning and remembering. I did a podcast a couple of days ago with Judge Ludig, who is, a longtime conservative judge, and he sort of went through the various, what the, American values are. And he said, this moment right now is an opportunity because I think American had become complacent about things like democracy and freedom and due process and the rule of law and all of those things. And now there's an opportunity to say, this is why it's important. Okay, to be an American means that somebody with a mask should not be able to take you or your sister or your brother or your father or your son, take them off the street, put them in a prison with no recourse to the courts. People get that. But I think that those cases need to be made again, and they need to be made in very graphic terms and point like, look, this is going on. Is this your idea of America? So, look, for Donald Trump, the cruelty is the point, but also the brutality is the point. The glee with which, for example, they are celebrating the alligator Alcatraz, that whole thing. They are tumescent with glee about all of that. I wonder whether or not that how that actually plays with Americans who actually like, is this really who you want to be? Do you really want to let's talk about why this kind of brutality and cruelty, does not represent the better angels of America. So again, there are certain things that have not resonated with voters, but I think I would like to hear people talk about freedom more.
Well, in some ways, it's a classic overinterpretation of one's mandate. And
Right.
obviously, we saw this with, Joe Biden. He won on something of a bipartisan sort of let's put these divisions behind us message and ran an ultimately, probably the most left wing White House that we have seen in several generations. And um,
You think
and
so?
ultimately became very unpopular on,
Hmm,
inflation and immigration and things like that. I mean, the American Rescue Plan was, large and ultimately proved to be inflationary, putting a whole bunch of progressive spending priorities in that I don't think any other Democratic president in my lifetime has tried to do. The policy on the border was very liberal from day one in terms of overturning what restrictions Trump had put in place, and there was a backlash against Joe Biden in many ways as a result. And what we're seeing now, and in some ways, Biden's White House was more afraid or felt more like it had to follow the wishes of the activist class than I think the Trump White House does feel, because Trump has proven that he can just not listen to the activists and there are very few repercussions, right? Like the Secretary of Health and Human Services today is pro abortion in a Republican White House.
right.
And if that's not evidence that he's not afraid of the activist class, I don't know what is. So, in some ways, the way that Biden behaved as president was a reaction to the activists that are always sort of like nipping at the politicians' heels, like afraid of taking a more moderate position on immigration, even once it was clear that it was a crisis at the border. Pursuing these big spending bills once inflation had already taken root. And the like, because that's what, the left part of the Democratic Party wanted. Trump doesn't need to do that in a way, or he won't feel that same pressure because he is a singular character and he is like the singular leader of the Republican Party. So he could, moderate a little on the things that you're talking
Good.
about. Like, I think at the border he's popular. I mean, overall, we still see in polling that Americans prefer Republicans over Democrats on the issue of immigration overall, even though
Right.
Trump is now, yes, underwater on the issue of immigration. He's net -3 on immigration, according to the averages that track this stuff. Um, so they may be happy with the border, but I think the enforcement stuff for people who are in the country illegally today is going to become unpopular quickly because it's the human stories
Correct.
that you've been talking about and leaning into alligator Alcatraz and all of that. That is an overinterpretation of the mandate that he had on immigration, and I think will in many ways prove to be increasingly unpopular as time goes on. And so, yeah, I think presidents have the past two presidents, Trump and
Always
Biden,
did.
have had difficulty sort of staying within a reasonable interpretation of the dates that they were given at the election.
Okay, what you just said was really, really good, and I want to like have radical agreement with a couple of points, but also I found it very, very interesting the way you described the Biden administration, because I think there was a certain amount of denial, including among never Trumpers, about how the left turn that Joe Biden had made, and so there is a sort of a revisionist history out there that Joe Biden ran as a centrist and then governed as a centrist, and therefore represents the failure of centrism. And actually, as you point out, he did move hard to the left. And it was interesting. There was a debate where, I mean, there were certain never Trumpers out there, who I'm not going to mention, who argued vigorously, no, 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 it's not true that he is left wing. It is not true that he has moved to the left. He, in fact, is centrist. And so not only did he move to the left, but he did not have the personality or the energy to go and sell it. The other point that you're making is incredibly important, and it is the difference between the parties up until now. The Democratic Party, has been in the thrall of many of these activists and many of these elite activists, and has been very afraid to break with them because they have been so dominant. Trump has none of that actual concern. This debate that we've had for years, what is the breaking point, for Republicans with Donald Trump? And I think by now, can we just say this directly? There is no breaking point. He can do whatever the fuck he wants, and they will go along with it. And you mentioned even on abortion, I can't see that. Democrats are much more nervous about breaking with their activist class. Now, there is a debate that is going on now about this activist class and the way in which it has caused the alienation. But your analysis of the Biden administration is exactly correct. And I do think that if we're ever going to have an honest assessment of what happened is on issue after issue, they did move beyond their mandate, but Maybe a more vigorous, charismatic president could have sold that, but Joe Biden was not that guy. So you can't do it unless you have someone who is going to explain it. So I think this was one of the fails, I think, unfortunately.
I want to make sure that we talk about Wisconsin
Yeah.
politics while we have some time together. So well, what I do now is host the GD Politics podcast and have the GD Politics Substack. So subscribe, and also folks should subscribe to you as well. Um, but early on in my career, I went to work at Wisconsin Public Radio, and so I was based in Madison, although traveled around the state a decent amount. And so I covered Wisconsin politics for about 3 years. That was during
Yeah.
Scott Walker's governorship,
Wow.
in particular during his reelection campaign in 2014. So I was living in Wisconsin when you were still a conservative talk radio host. Um, it was a different era, but in some ways, the division and rancor that ended up taking hold across the country 2 years later was starting in Wisconsin, and the axis of conflict was very different, and as well, it was over sort of unions and taxation and the American Club for Growth form of republicanism versus the more, I don't know, old school progressive form of liberalism, or the Democratic Party, the Russ Feingolds and that sort of thing. Um, I'm curious what you make of, as the country's politics have evolved, how has the axis of conflict in Wisconsin evolved?
Well, I mean, first of all, you go back to that period. In the 2010 election, no state flipped as decisively from blue to red as, do I have that right? Blue to red as Wisconsin. I mean, in 2009, Democrats controlled absolutely everything. I mean, big majorities. And then after 2010, they lost it all. And frankly, that has been a reset of Wisconsin politics since then. But I think back on that era a lot, obviously. And one of the thing, and you're exactly right when you say this was in many ways a precursor of the hyper partisanship that hit the country, and the fight over Act 10 was really the fulcrum of it. Now, on one level, it was about collective bargaining rights for public employees, but the one thing that I saw, and there's a lesson that I learned from all of that, is that at a certain point, the fight becomes about the fight, not about the substance. I remember early on there were some polls showing that Walker was deeply unpopular in taking away the collective bargaining rights of public employees. He had not so, and he admitted at the time he hadn't sold it, he hadn't campaigned on it, he hadn't explained it to the voters. So you were talking about big numbers of people go, why are you doing this? However, as the partisan lines began to form, as the recalls began, as the huge rallies began, it was like watching the tribalization, the hyperpartisanship of the divide. So when I say the fight becomes about the fight, at a certain point, it's not about the substance of the legislation because most people do not go to bed and wake up thinking about collective bargaining rights. I mean, it was a little esoteric. They thought it was going to be quick and easy, but it became it became the spark for something else. So when I say the fight is about the fight, I see this with MAGA over and over again, where it's a mistake to think that people are actually debating the principle or the issue. It's about us beating you. It is about us winning versus you winning. It's about beating the other side. And so one of the things that I think has been disconcerting is watching, the MAGA movement actually just flip its position on various issues. We're Republican Party is about American exceptionalism and leadership, and we're anti-Russia, and now we're suddenly pro-Russia. Well, again, if you understand that the fight is about the fight, you understand that it's almost Orwellian. It's almost 1984. It's about that, and I think that has really been one of the things that started in Wisconsin, and you're seeing it now. Republicans still dominate the legislature. Democrats finally got their act together and have been very, very successful. The now former chairman of the Democratic Party, Ben Wickler, was probably the most effective state party chairman that I've ever seen. And so you have had these victories in the off year elections and in the Supreme Court elections. So Wisconsin is still mean, on a razor's edge.
Yeah, I mean, so Wisconsin was the tipping point state in 2016 and 2020, which means, if you line up all of the states in terms of their margin, it was the state that put the winning candidate over the edge in terms of the electoral college. So obviously played a very big role in the first two Trump elections. And then in 2024, it was not the tipping point state, but it was the most closely divided of the battleground states. And so, um, I'm curious if you see, a couple things have been happening in Wisconsin in terms of the electorate. It's has pockets of high levels of education and also wealth. And Dane County is a prime example of that, highly educated part of the state that has just gone sort of increasingly Democratic in every subsequent election. The voter turnout rates there are,
Massive.
sky high. People are so civically engaged, and it's really it was a bastion of sort of liberalism in the Democratic Party in the Scott Walker era, and it has become one of the most turbocharged charged bastions of liberalism and democratic voting and the likes in the country in some ways. And then there are places like Ozaukee County that are
Where
amongst
I
the
live.
best educated. Oh, well, there you go. Amongst the best educated and wealthiest parts of the state that were very Republican back in the Scott Walker era and have inched left over the past decade, getting to a point. I mean, I think it was one of the only places in the country that actually moved a little bit more towards Kamala Harris or the Democrats between 2020 and 2024. So continuing this trend. I was in Ozaukee County. I was in Wisconsin. I was in Milwaukee for the first Republican debate of the primary so this was August of 2023. And I was up in Ozaukee County talking to just out on the street talking to voters. This is when I worked for ABC, talking to voters about, who they wanted to win the primary. And you've heard a lot of Nikki Haley support. And
Hmm.
I'm sure you're unsurprised to hear that. But it's this very particular part of the country that does well, um, used to be very Republican, and is now sort of purple. Do you see those places just continuing to move to the left? Like,
Yes.
how do you see, and you can maybe even talk about some of the rural areas that have obviously gone more Republican over the past decade. How do you see the different sort of regions of Wisconsin playing out politically going forward?
Okay, well, you're exactly right about Ozaukee County, and I live here in Ozaukee County. It was one of the WOW counties.
Mhm.
Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington counties. This used to be the beating heart of the Republican voter base in Wisconsin. In fact, the margins from the WOW counties were so great that they basically countered they offset Dane County. That's no longer the case. They have been declining. Ozaukee County being the most dramatic. So I live in Mequon, Wisconsin. Cedarburg is just to the north of us. My wife went to a No Kings rally in Cedarburg again not that long ago. This would have been the heart of the Republican thing. Huge turnout for all of this, which was really kind of interesting to see that kind of a shift. So you are seeing this, but these are the majority making counties. And so it will be the centrist Democrats are going to do well here. Um, I still haven't gotten over the last midterm election. Ron Johnson won narrowly, in a year in which Democrats won statewide. Okay, so the same year that Tony Evers was elected as a Democrat, Ron Johnson was also reelected. And the real difference is that about 50,000 people that voted for Tony Evers did not vote for the Democratic nominee Mandela Barnes. And Mandela Barnes was very, very progressive. And there were those of us who said, look, Ron Johnson is extremely vulnerable. This state is ready to get rid of him, but do not nominate somebody far, far to the left. So even in a state that is hyper partisan, there is this segment of the electorate. If Mandela Barnes had gotten the same number of votes as Democrat Tony Evers, Ron Johnson would not be in the United States Senate today. So it does matter the kinds of candidates that you have in some of these swing areas. Now, again, Wisconsin is divided into it's like multiple states. There's Milwaukee, then Dane County, overwhelmingly Democrat. Milwaukee has a turnout problem. Dane County does not. Then you have the WOW counties that have gotten soft. They're still Republican, but it's much, much softer. Big opportunity. Rural Wisconsin's kind of a different story. The Republicans continue to rack up bigger majorities twice for Barack Obama and then voted for Donald Trump. And that is still continues to be a problem. And then, of course, you have the Green Bay area, the Fox Valley area. But what I do think is interesting, these state Supreme Court elections that we've had here, big turnout elections, huge stakes elections. I think this was the end of Elon Musk, by the way, here in Wisconsin. He came in and he dropped, what, $20 million on the state Supreme Court seat. And yet, um, as a test of where Wisconsin's going, the more progressive candidate won overwhelmingly. I mean, this was a surprise to a lot of us who had figured every election is decided by 20,000 votes. So, right now, if you have the right environment, this state can actually, continue to move from purple, perhaps back to blue. But a lot of it depends on the turnout and then how these swing voters vote.
Yeah, I think a lot of Democratic energy in Wisconsin is focused around, Dane County and sort of keeping turnout there sky high, and then also making inroads with these sort of suburban voters with high levels of education in the WOW counties. Do you see any Democrats in Wisconsin politics who are making a credible pitch to rural Wisconsin?
Well, there one of the Wisconsin has the same problem that national Democrats have. Tony Evers is in his 70s, and he has to decide whether he's going to be running for a third term or making room for a younger, more dynamic candidate. We don't know how that's going to go. So, I think that's one of the issues. Tammy Baldwin is somebody that ought to have a higher profile because she's a progressive Democrat. She's an open lesbian, and she has won consistently here in Wisconsin. So I guess my one of my
Talking about
pieces of
cheese, she's
advice.
always every opening ad I see from Tammy Baldwin in an election year is like her on a farm talking about
Yes,
dairy.
and you know what? She gets it. I mean, there are these stars who know how to talk to these voters. And again, I mentioned Alyssa Slotkin and others. These folks, it's interesting to me how all of the celebrities on the Democratic side are of a certain, you know, ideological setting. And yet you have these really, really successful Democrats like Tammy Baldwin and Slotkin and Abigail Spanberger who are winning in these key states. And I guess sort of have to ask, why are they not getting the kinds of attention that the AOCs are getting? And I understand that it's kind of exciting seeing Jasmine Crockett, dropping F-bombs and stuff like that. But it's these guys who are actually winning elections in areas like this. And you make a really good point. Tammy Baldwin, you know, is not hanging out in a Madison Beer Hall when she does her ads. She's out in rural Wisconsin talking about dairy issues, which is why she's a member of the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're nearing an hour here, so I don't want to take up too much time. But any closing thoughts on Wisconsin, the politics of debt, Elon Musk, and the bill formerly known as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act?
Well, I do want to just repeat what I said that I think the voters in Wisconsin can take a great deal of pride in derailing Elon Musk because you think about that moment when he was setting himself up to be the kingmaker in the Republican Party. Remember how powerful he was, and he came in here and parachuted into Wisconsin, got $20 million. Shows up in Green Bay. He's wearing the cheese head, and then he has this humiliating defeat and if you trace the trajectory of Elon Musk, you realize that it was sort of at that moment when Republicans got tired and the bromance began to go. So, among the many sins for which Wisconsin has to answer for, I think Wisconsin could take a great deal of pride in the role that they played in the defenestration of Elon Musk.
Well, I think it's a great example of sometimes people getting confused about what the game changers in an election actually are, right? Like Donald Trump did not win the 2024 election because of Elon Musk's like 200 million or more dollars. Like he won that election on the issues. Americans thought the country was on the wrong track. Biden was super unpopular and they trusted Republicans more on inflation and immigration. Like,
Yes.
and Elon Musk didn't reach anybody in the country who didn't already know about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, right? Like in a presidential election, even $100 million is not that important because you have sort of total market saturation with these things, right? Like Trump opens his mouth and everyone pays attention. And there was no avoiding knowing who was in the White House when people felt like things were going poorly. And so, Elon Musk going to Wisconsin and dropping another $20 million, I think hit home that it's not the money that's making the difference here. And so if you don't have his money, then it's at that point it's kind of like, well, what's the point?
Well, that's exactly right, and this is an important point. At least at the presidential level, I think money is highly overrated. It's still important, obviously, at the local level, and in terms of defining the issue, especially if you can get out early.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we're hitting the midday mark on the East Coast, and it's about 11 o'clock a.m. for you. So we'll leave it there. Thanks for joining me today, Charlie. This has been
Hey,
fun.
thank you.
All
Fascinating
right.
conversation. Thank you so much, Dan.
Yes, absolutely. Take care.